stop. Stop scrolling. Stop whatever you were about to do in the next 10 seconds. Because what is unfolding here is not just another royal commentary cycle. It feels like a carefully assembled narrative grenade has just gone off in the middle of an already fractured royal landscape. A line reportedly tied to Tom Bower's published assessment is now being whispered, repeated, dissected, almost like a verdict people are afraid to fully say out loud in one breath. Harry and Meghan, according to that framing, are being placed as a more sustained institutional threat than Prince Andrew himself. And the moment that comparison enters the conversation, everything shifts because suddenly this is no longer just about scandal history. It becomes about ongoing pressure, ongoing visibility, ongoing consequences that refuse to settle. And the unsettling part, it is not even framed as chaos that has already happened. It is framed as something still unfolding, still building, still expanding into the next wave of headlines that no one can fully predict, but everyone seems to be watching for. Because in this narrative, Prince Andrew is described as a closed chapter, a story that has already burned through its worst pages and now sits in a kind of institutional silence, sealed off, contained, no longer actively generating new waves of public disruption in the same way it once did. The damage in that reading is treated as already done, already absorbed into the royal structure like a wound that has scarred over. But then comes the other side of the comparison, and that is where the tension sharpens. Harry and Meghan are framed as something entirely different, not static, not sealed, not finished. Instead, they are positioned as an ongoing force, a continuing stream of decisions, appearances, projects, interviews, branding shifts, public statements, and commercial activity that keeps feeding new cycles of attention. Every move in this interpretation becomes part of a larger pattern that never fully settles into silence. And that is where the tone of the entire conversation changes, because it is no longer about past controversies. It becomes about momentum, about visibility, about how long a story can keep generating heat before it either stabilizes or collapses under its own attention. The narrative being pushed here is not subtle. It suggests that while one figure has already reached a kind of endpoint in public consequence, the other remains in motion, still producing outcomes, still influencing perception, still pulling institutional attention in multiple directions at once. And suddenly, every previous moment gets pulled back into the spotlight like evidence in a case that is still being built in real time. Every interview that once felt like a standalone event is now reframed as part of a chain reaction. Every public appearance becomes another data point in a pattern observers claim they can no longer ignore. Even the softer, more curated family-oriented content is reinterpreted not as harmless visibility, but as strategic communication layered over a far more complex reputation battle playing out beneath the surface. And this is where the gossip energy intensifies, because nothing is treated as isolated anymore. Everything is connected. Everything is suspiciously consistent. Everything is allegedly part of the same arc, depending on whose interpretation you follow. Meanwhile, the Prince Andrew storyline is treated almost like a shadow comparison point, a fixed reference, a cautionary benchmark, something that no longer evolves, but instead lingers in the background as a completed scandal file. And that contrast is exactly what fuels the claim being made in this commentary space, that one narrative is finished while the other refuses to finish at all. But here is where the tension really starts to climb. If one story is contained and the other is ongoing, then what happens when the ongoing story reaches its own breaking point? Or does it even have one? Because according to this framing, there is no clear ending in sight. Only continuation, only escalation, only the next cycle waiting to happen. And as this idea spreads through commentary circles, it starts pulling in everything around it. Invictus Games discussions suddenly get folded into questions of leadership pressure and sponsorship stability. Commercial projects get reinterpreted as signs of momentum or instability depending on who is analyzing them. Even public appearances in places like Geneva or Sydney are reread through the same lens: turnout, reception, narrative control, perceived relevance. Nothing escapes it. Everything becomes part of the same unfolding storyline. And that is exactly why this comparison is landing so loudly. Because it is not just a statement about two people. It is a statement about two different types of public consequence. One that ends and one that keeps going. And once that idea enters the conversation, it doesn't leave easily. It starts reshaping how people interpret every new headline, every new photo, every new appearance. Suddenly, audiences are not just watching events anymore, they are watching patterns, searching for meaning inside repetition, trying to decide whether what they are seeing is stability or something far more unstable hiding behind polished presentation. And right at the center of it all sits that single, sharpened claim attributed to Tom Bower's published commentary. commentary, acting almost like a pivot point the entire discussion keeps circling back to. Because once you frame one royal storyline as finished and the other as unfinished, you are no longer just reporting on events, you are implying a race that has not ended yet. And nobody watching this space can agree on where the finish line even is supposed to be. And just when it feels like the comparison has reached its sharpest edge, the narrative refuses to settle. Because the second layer of this story is not about who has done more damage in the past, but who is still actively generating consequences in the present. That is where the tone shifts from commentary into something almost like an ongoing investigation that never closes its file, only adds new pages. Because according to this published framing, Prince Andrew is no longer moving in the public sense. He exists in a kind of enforced quiet, a background presence in the royal architecture, with his major controversies already fully exposed, processed, and sealed into historical record. There are no new speeches, no new ventures, no new strategic appearances that reset the narrative. In this reading, he is a fixed point of damage, not a moving source of it. And that distinction is exactly what makes the contrast with Harry and Meghan feel so charged in this discussion. Because the Sussex narrative is described as something entirely different, not frozen, not contained, but constantly active, constantly producing new moments that re-enter the public bloodstream and restart the cycle of interpretation all over again. One appearance becomes 3 interpretations. One announcement becomes a debate. One brand move becomes a question about intention, timing, and impact. Nothing ever fully resolves, it only evolves into the next reaction. And this is where the gossip framing becomes almost obsessive in its detail. Even small moments are treated like signals. A photograph becomes a message. A public event becomes a strategy test. A commercial launch becomes a reflection of deeper instability or ambition depending on who is narrating it. The story is no longer about isolated incidents, but about what those incidents allegedly reveal when stacked together. Meanwhile, the broader royal system is described as watching both trajectories differently. One requires containment. The other requires constant interpretation. One is managed as a closed file. The other is treated as an open feed that keeps refreshing itself whether the institution wants it to or not. And that is where the tension becomes almost uncomfortable, because the implication is not just that one story is louder, but that one story is structurally incapable of becoming quiet. Every attempt at normalcy is reread as strategy. Every pause is interpreted as repositioning. Every new project is measured not only by success, but by what it does to the larger narrative already surrounding it. Even the commercial side of the Sussex world is pulled into this loop. Partnerships, media deals, public-facing projects, lifestyle branding elements, all of it becomes part of a larger question being asked in commentary spaces. Is this sustainable momentum, or is it narrative overload? Is the audience still growing, or simply watching out of familiarity with the ongoing drama? And this is where Tom Bower's attributed framing becomes the gravitational center again, because it is used in this discourse as a kind of measuring stick, not just for past conduct, but for ongoing visibility, not just for historical controversy, but for present-day narrative intensity. It becomes less about judgment and more about classification, which storyline is closed and which one refuses to close. The uncomfortable implication underneath all of this is that open stories never really stay neutral. They attract attention, analysis, reinterpretation, and constant reframing. They become ecosystems of commentary, where every new detail either reinforces the existing perception or challenges it slightly, keeping the entire structure alive. And so the question hanging over everything is not simply about comparison anymore. It is about duration. How long can a public narrative remain active before it either stabilizes into normalcy or burns out under its own visibility? Because right now, according to this framing, one story has already reached its endpoint, while the other continues to move forward, refusing to settle into silence, refusing to stop generating reaction, refusing to become a closed chapter. And that is exactly why this comparison keeps echoing across commentary spaces. Not because it is settled, but because it is not. Not because it is simple, but because it keeps expanding every time it is repeated.